Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. I'm the author of the 10 UN Academy series, and this is English Nerd. So recently I announced that my next book project, the one that I'm currently working on, is a retelling of Hamlet from one of the other characters' points of view. And so I thought it would be a worthwhile thing just to discuss what my process is as far as writing a retelling, because I've never done that before. Firian Rising and the rest of the 10 UN Academy series, that was all young adult. That was actually based on something that I had started writing in high school, and it was obviously inspired by a variety of different sources, but really it became its own thing, and it was never a retelling of any particular source. However, this one very intentionally is. LAERTES is a retelling of Hamlet, and so I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts on what I think, in my experience, makes a successful retelling, and hopefully is what I've been able to accomplish, and then what my process has been in my particular retelling as well. So just a few general comments as far as writing a retelling. I assume that if you're watching this, that you have a story in mind that speaks to you. Maybe it's Romeo and Juliet, or it's Peter Pan, or it's Beauty and the Beast, or whatever it might be. Really, retellings are all the rage now, as I'm sure you're well aware, and I'm not mad at the trend. Sometimes trends are not my thing, but I think if a retelling is done well, it can be really compelling and an awesome treat for somebody who already likes that story, or an entry into a new story that perhaps you didn't know before. So I assume that you've chosen one. The question then becomes, okay, how do you want to retell it? How closely do you want to retell it? I think one of the main issues with this retelling trend, as far as the more like artistic failures go, is that people stick too close to the source material and they have nothing new to say. The immediate thing that comes to mind actually is not books, but it's the Disney remakes, the live action remakes of the animated classics. So you think about The Lion King, you think about Beauty and the Beast. I love those movies, the originals. And so I watched both of the live action of those two, and they really had nothing new to add. It was almost just beat for beat redoing what had been done better in the past. So I would caution against doing a beat for beat retelling without adding anything new, any of your own spin, any character notes or setting or something that differentiates it from the original. What is yours going to offer that the original didn't? It ought to be something different. So I would suggest that you identify how closely you want this to match the source material. Is it just the occasional beat, like in, you can kind of see back there, Marissa Meyer's Lunar Chronicles, which I love, each of which is very loosely a retelling of a fairy tale. So the Cinder, the first one, is the closest to the source material. You can definitely see those Cinderella beats. But by the time you get to Winter, it's easy to forget that it's a retelling because it's definitely taken on a life of its own. It's sci-fi, it feels almost more like Star Wars or something. But then the Snow White character, because that's the retelling of the last book, falls into this kind of enchanted coma or the equivalent thereof, and you're reminded, oh right, this is a Snow White retelling, and here's just a little hint, you get apples and things like that thrown in, but it's really not very close at all. So do you want something that's going to be very close? Do you want something that just hits a couple of the recognizable beats so people can go, oh right, that's the retelling? Whatever you decide to do, and there's no right or wrong way to do this, make sure that the story and the characters are your own. They're not just kind of copied and pasted from somebody else's work, but make sure that they have this life that goes beyond the original source material and feels more like your own character, so that you have their story to tell. Like, identify with those those characters in a personal way. That would be my recommendation. So as far as my own process goes, I have been obsessed with Hamlet for years and years and years. If you have been around the channel, I am just a huge fan. I've taught this book many, many times. I'm actually in the middle of teaching it again as I'm filming this video, and I've thought for a very long time that I wanted to tell the story from LAERTES' point of view, but I hadn't gone ahead with that because I was working on the Tanyuan Academy series and finishing that up, and I just didn't quite know when it was going to fit into my scheduled releases. But when I completed that series, I felt like I had the space to do something different. So I decided to move away temporarily. I'll return to it. Away from young adult fantasy and into this standalone passion project that I've had in mind for so long. So the very first thing I did was I bought a new copy of Hamlet, as though I need to do that. I mean, there's a whole video about all the Hamlet stuff that I have and the copies of Hamlet that I have, but I wanted one in particular that I could just annotate with LAERTES specific things, character notes and turns of phrase, and trying to identify things about him in particular that I had never noticed before, because all the times that I've read through Hamlet in the past, it's been teaching generally what the story is about, and there are particular beats that I always point out, and you can watch all of those in my scene for scene Hamlet series on this channel. But I wanted to look at it through a different lens, and I wanted to actually investigate and research some of the parts that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because the language is so rich and so old that there still were parts that were mysterious. And so I had such a blast learning all these new things about Hamlet, this play that I'd read so many times, and it still had these treasures to uncover. And so that was the first thing I went through. I made all these notes. I started to figure out the type of character quirks that I wanted to give to LAERTES in particular, but also to Hamlet and Ophelia and some of the other people who feature prominently in his story. Then the next thing I did was try to narrow down what the setting was going to be. And there, in my mind, were essentially three options. There was around the year 1600, which was when Shakespeare wrote the play. So I was going to do that for a little while. I thought about it, but ultimately I discarded that idea. The second one is going back to the source material of Hamlet, and I did some research on that as well. So there is a story about a Danish prince who has a very similar name that ruled around the year 1000, I believe. So that would put him more in like Viking era Denmark, but that didn't ring true either. So ultimately I decided to do a more modern version, kind of like what Shakespeare did. So he looked back at the source material from 500-600 years before, and then placed the story into kind of a fantasy version of his own world. He even makes some references to what was current for him, and still keeps some of the touch points from the older time as well. It's almost this fantasy in and of itself. And so I wanted to do something kind of similar. I wanted to ground it in a particular time, but not so firmly that there wasn't some wiggle room. Because of course, Claudius, the king of Denmark in the story, is not the king of Denmark in any sort of modern time. So I was thinking to myself, I wanted to do a dark academia retelling of the story. And dark academia is a very specific aesthetic. I've done videos about it before, and I thought, well, I could do something a little bit more modern, but I wanted it to feel old enough that some of the turns of phrase I would put in there wouldn't feel as out of place. And so I settled on the 1920s. So most of the story actually takes place in Paris in the 1920s. It kind of goes back and forth between Paris and Denmark because the character LAERTES goes back and forth. So I figured that out, and I started just writing notes. and researching further. So I have this whole document where I wrote down all these notes, either from the annotating that I was doing or the research I was doing on Paris in the 1920s. I have a Pinterest board, but I was writing down all these things that I wanted to include, from just references to things to research to, I listed all the scenes that LAERTES appears in. I wanted to do a close retelling as far as the actual scenes are concerned. Where he appears in Hamlet, I wanted to really stick close to the source material there, not in the exact wording, because obviously that's obscure for today's audiences, but really close in meaning with the flow of the conversation and everything. So I started making tons of notes. I felt for a long time, and I still kind of feel, though less so as I'm in the middle of drafting here, that I just was spilling all these puzzle pieces onto the ground and trying to look for patterns. Because at that point I didn't have a starting place exactly. I didn't have the arc of the story. Stories have to have that through line, that thing that's going to drag you from the beginning to the end, and the beginning and the end have to make sense with one another, and so I hadn't figured out all that yet, but I was just writing down all of these notes and through looking at the notes and starting to put them into different categories and starting to get them into more of a chronological sort of order, I started to see the arc. Like, what is this story really about at its core? It's not going to be, it's going to keep some of the themes from Hamlet, because I do want this to be a Hamlet retelling. I want it to deal with some of the same questions about madness and about life and death and about thought versus action and about the afterlife and all these things, but I wanted to look at it through a different lens. So it's going to keep some of the themes, but it's not an identical story. It's not Hamlet's story, it's LAERTES' story. So what is his character arc from the beginning to the end? And so I started to see what that was going to be, and I'm not going to tell you much, especially for people who do not know the story of Hamlet. No spoilers, besides the fact that he goes back and forth between Paris and Denmark for university. But then I saw, okay, here's what we're following. It's his internal struggle, his internal change that's going to be the connecting point from the beginning to the end. And it was once I figured out the arc that I could really identify, okay, where should the story begin? I think it should begin right here, and then it ends where the play ends. So I needed to make sure that matched up. Anyway, I know I'm kind of rambling, but I've had all these things on my mind for ages, and I haven't been able to share much of them with you. And if you are in the process of doing anything similar, I don't know if it's particularly helpful, but this was my process. So I figured out the arc, figured out where it began, figured out where it was going to end, and then I started to break the notes into scenes, not just into sort of a chronological order, but really, all right, here are the different scenes, and here's the order in which things happen. And from doing that, I was able to recognize different plot holes or things that really ought to be expanded upon or beefed up, and then I was able to start writing. I still am doing a lot of research kind of in between. I'll stop all the time and go down these little rabbit holes, and I've been researching everything from 1920s fashion to the layout of Paris, so that I know where people are going and how they're getting there. And I've been in contact with Kronborg Castle, which is the castle that Hamlet takes place in. It's called Elsinore in the play, but I don't know how you pronounce it in Danish. Helsingør, something really similar. That's actually the little town where Kronborg Castle exists. So I'm learning all these things, and it's coming together, this story. It is going to be a close retelling, but since it is from such a different character's point of view, I think it's going to offer something new. He's going to have some different revelations than Hamlet does in the original story, although it's still going to have the flavor of Hamlet. I wanted this to be kind of a love letter to the original play. So people who love the play, I think, are really going to like this retelling as well. But I didn't want it to stick so close that it was inaccessible for somebody who didn't already know the story, but could just enjoy this book on its own merits. So that is my rather rambling process. It was a rambly process, but man, I was obsessed with annotating and researching and organizing for months, and I took a bit of a breather, but then I dove into drafting, and it has been really an exciting change of pace. Instead of doing young adult fantasy, to do this adult dark academia retelling instead. Like I said, I will go back. Young adult fantasy is going to be my first love, I think, but this has been so much fun. So if you're thinking about writing a retelling, go for it. Just be aware that there are some different considerations for a retelling than there are for an original story. You do want to stay true to some aspects of the original while still having your own message, your own take, your own thing to say. Okay, well, make sure to subscribe for more English nerdy goodness. Hit the notification button, like this video if you like it, and I'll see you next Monday. Bye.